On Christmas Day, my brother lifted his glass of bourbon, looked straight at me across my mother's dining room table and said, 12 years in uniform. And still a nobody. She doesn't deserve our family name. Then my father nodded. That was the part that got me, not Mark's mouth. I was used to that. My brother had been born with a spotlight in one hand and a shovel in the other, always ready to bury somebody if it made him look taller. But my father, he sat there at the head of the table in his red Christmas sweater, the one my mother bought him from Belk every other year, and he nodded like Mark had finally said out loud what everybody had been politely swallowing. For a second, nobody moved. The ham was sitting in the middle of the table, glazed with brown sugar and pineapple rings. My niece's Barbie dream house was half unwrapped near the fireplace. The TV in the den was still lowly humming with a basketball game nobody was watching. My mother's good china, the white plates with the thin gold rim, clicked softly when my aunt set her fork down too hard. I remember all of it. Funny what your mind keeps when your heart gets slapped in public. I was 39 years old, a major in the United States Army, and I had spent 12 years learning how to stay calm when rooms got ugly. I had been in windowless briefings at 2 a.m. I had sat across from men who lied for a living. I had signed papers I couldn't talk about and missed holidays I couldn't explain. But sitting in my parents' dining room in Knoxville, Tennessee with cranberry sauce drying on my plate, I felt about 16. My brother Mark leaned back in his chair, pleased with himself. He wore a navy quarter-zip sweater, a gold watch, and the kind of grin men get when they think money made them wise. Come on, he said, waving his glass toward me. Everybody's thinking it. Rachel shows up every year with some little military haircut, no husband, no kids, no real house, and we're all supposed to act like she's some hero. My cousin Denise, whispered Mark, but not loud enough to mean it. My mother looked down at her napkin. I sat there with both hands in my lap, pressing my thumb into the scar near my knuckle. Old habit. Small pain to keep the bigger one from showing. I had driven 7 hours from Fayetteville that morning after getting off shift late the night before. I'd stopped at a Walgreens outside Asheville to buy stocking stuffers because everything else was closed. I had brought my mother a bottle of Estee Lauder perfume. She liked my father a hardback book about the Battle of Midway. And for my grandfather, I had brought an old field watch I'd found at an estate sale and had repaired. It wasn't expensive, but it still ticked. I thought he'd like that. My father cleared his throat, and for one hopeful half-second I thought he was going to shut Mark down. Instead, he said, Rachel, your brother's being blunt, but maybe this is something you need to hear. The room got smaller. He didn't look angry. That almost made it worse. He looked tired of pretending I was enough. You've been in the service a long time, he went on. And we're proud of service, of course we are. But at some point a person has to show something for it. Mark has built a business. He provides jobs. He carries this family forward. Mark gave a little shrug like humility had briefly visited and found no place to sit. Dad continued. You don't tell us anything. You don't bring anyone home. You never seem to advance. You just disappear for months, then come back expecting everyone to respect the mystery. I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because if I didn't laugh, I might say something I could never take back. The truth was, I didn't expect anyone to respect the mystery. I expected them to respect me. There's a difference. But I couldn't tell them about my work. Not the places, not the people, not the stakes. To them, I had some vague government job with a uniform attached. I was the daughter who never had details, never had photos, never had a neat answer for church ladies who asked, So what exactly do you do, honey? I usually said logistics. That word is a wonderful bucket. You can throw almost anything in it. Mark smiled wider. Exactly. Logistics. Desk work with salutes. A few people chuckled because they were uncomfortable, and uncomfortable people often mistake cruelty for humor if it lets them breathe again. My father didn't laugh, but he didn't correct him either. That was when Mark said the line about the family name. And my father nodded. I pushed my chair back. Not dramatically, just enough for the legs to scrape the hardwood. My mother flinched at the sound. I think I'm going to head out, I said. My voice sounded too calm. That was another habit. Mark snorted. There she goes, tactical retreat. I looked at him then. Really looked? My brother was 42, with perfect teeth, a leased Mercedes, and a real estate company that had his face on billboards from Knoxville to Sevierville. Bennett Properties, built on trust. I'd driven past one that morning and nearly choked on my gas station coffee. Mark, I said quietly, you don't know enough about my life to insult it accurately. That wiped a little shine off his face. Not much, but enough. Then we heard the cane. Tap. Pause. Tap. It came from the hallway near the front room, slow and uneven against the hardwood. Everyone turned. My grandfather stood in the doorway. General William Bennett, retired 4-star, 88 years old, 6 feet tall if his back wasn't hurting, and still the only man I'd ever known who could quiet a room without raising his voice. He had changed since the last Christmas. I noticed it right away. His shoulders sat lower. His left hand trembled around the head of his cane. His skin looked thinner, almost papery under the warm dining room light. But his eyes were clear. Sharp, too. The kind of clear that makes guilty people suddenly interested in their plates. "Dad," my father said, half rising, "you should have called. I would have helped you in." Granddad ignored him. He looked at Mark first, then at my father. Last he looked at me. Not with pity, I would have hated pity. He looked at me like he saw the uniform even though I was wearing jeans and a gray sweater. "What did I just hear?" he asked. Nobody answered. The dishwasher hummed in the kitchen. Somewhere outside, a neighbor's dog barked twice and quit. Mark set his bourbon down. "Granddad, we were just having a family conversation." "No," Granddad said. "You were having a performance." My aunt covered her mouth. Mark's jaw tightened. I didn't mean anything by it. Granddad took one slow step into the room. His cane tapped once more. "You meant every word." That's the problem with weak men. They think honesty and cruelty are the same thing. My father's face reddened. "Dad, that's not fair." Granddad turned to him. "You nodded." 2 words. That was all it took. My father sat back down. Granddad came around the table slowly. Nobody offered to help him. Maybe they were afraid he'd bite. Maybe they were right. When he reached my chair, he put one hand on the back of it to steady himself. I saw the pain cross his face for a split second. His knees were bad. His hip, too. He hated anyone noticing. I started to stand. He gave the smallest shake of his head. So I stayed seated. Then he looked at the whole table and said, "If Rachel doesn't deserve your family name, then she'll use mine." No one breathed. Even Mark looked confused, which was a rare and refreshing sight. My father blinked. What is that supposed to mean? Granddad's mouth bent into something that was not quite a smile. "It means," he said, "there are things about Major Rachel Bennett that no one in this room has earned the right to know." My mother's eyes snapped up at the word major. Mark's hand froze around his glass. I looked down because suddenly I felt too seen. Granddad rested his hand briefly on my shoulder. His fingers were cold and bony, but his grip still had command in it. Then he said one more thing, softer this time. "And there are things about this family that are long overdue for daylight." That was the first time I saw fear move across my father's face. Not anger, not embarrassment. Fear. At the time, I thought my grandfather was only defending me. I didn't know he had been waiting for that room to show him exactly who they were. And I definitely didn't know that Christmas dinner was the first domino. I left my parents' house a little after 9 that night. Not because anyone asked me to. Honestly, after Granddad walked into that dining room, nobody seemed eager to say much of anything anymore. The whole house had turned stiff and careful, like everybody was suddenly aware they were standing on thin ice. My mother wrapped leftover ham in foil at the kitchen counter without looking directly at me. Dad disappeared into the den and turned the TV volume up too loud. Mark spent 20 straight minutes pretending to answer work emails while scrolling the same screen with his thumb. And Granddad? He sat in his old leather chair near the fireplace with my repaired field watch in his lap, listening to it tick. That image stayed with me the whole drive back to Fayetteville. Interstate 40 was mostly empty, except for truckers and exhausted families heading home after Christmas dinners. They probably survived instead of enjoyed. Around Bristol, fog rolled low across the highway, and I drove with both hands tight on the wheel, replaying every word from that table. 12 years in uniform, and still a nobody. The stupid thing was, part of me still wanted my father to take it back. At 39 years old, after deployments, classified briefings, sleepless nights, funerals, I couldn't attend birthdays. I forgot relationships that quietly died while I was overseas. A small part of me still wanted my dad to say he was proud of me. Human beings are embarrassing that way. I got back to my townhouse outside Fort Liberty just before 3 in the morning. The neighborhood was quiet except for somebody's inflatable Santa wheezing weakly in the cold wind. I stood in my kitchen eating wheat thins over the sink and staring at my phone. No messages from my family. One text from my deputy commander. "Need you in at 700. Wear civilian attire." That was it. No Merry Christmas. No explanation. Just work. I slept maybe 2 hours, By 7:30 the next morning, I was inside a secure federal building 40 minutes from base, sitting in a windowless conference room beside 3 people whose last names I technically knew, but whose actual jobs I probably never would. That was my life. Quiet rooms, locked doors, conversations nobody could repeat. A man from another agency slid a folder across the table toward me. "We may have movement through Savannah," he said. I opened the file. Shipping routes, names, timelines, photos. Normal people would have seen paperwork. I saw danger patterns. That's what 12 years had done to my brain. One of the younger analysts glanced at me and said, "You okay, Major Bennett? You look tired." "I was at a family Christmas," I said. The room laughed harder than the joke deserved, because everybody over 40 understood exactly what I meant. The meeting lasted 6 hours. By the end of it, we'd identified 2 possible security leaks and 1 fake company moving equipment through Georgia ports under agricultural permits. Nothing I could explain to civilians. Nothing I could tell my father the next time he implied I spent my days alphabetizing file cabinets. That part used to bother me more. In my 20s, I constantly felt torn between duty and normal life. I wanted people to understand me, wanted somebody to recognize the sacrifices without needing details. But classified work changes you. After a while, silence becomes muscle memory. You stop correcting people. You stop defending yourself. You learn how to let strangers underestimate you without flinching. Most days, anyway. I got home that evening exhausted enough to fall asleep sitting upright on the couch. Instead, I poured coffee that tasted like burnt dirt and called the only person in my family who had never treated my military service like an inconvenience. Granddad answered on the 3rd ring. "Well, he said you sound tired." "You sound smug." "That too," I smiled despite myself. He coughed a little before continuing. "Your mother says your brother's been sulking all day. Must be exhausting for him." "Apparently it is." I heard the creak of his recliner on the other end of the line. Then silence. Comfortable silence, though. The kind you only get with people who don't require performance from you. Finally, he said, "You know, your father called me this morning." That got my attention. And he asked if I was upset. I leaned back against my couch cushions. "Were you—" "No, angry is different from surprised." I rubbed my forehead. My temples had started throbbing around noon. "He's embarrassed," I said quietly. "Your father has spent most of his life confusing appearances with character." That sounded harsh, especially coming from him. Granddad had always been measured with words. Even when he was furious, he sounded controlled, like a man who'd learned long ago that shouting usually meant you'd already lost command of the room. I stared out my front window at the dark street outside. "You know what the worst part is?" I asked. "What?" "I think if I'd married some dentist in Charlotte and posted vacation pictures online twice a year, they'd respect me more than they do now." Granddad made a low sound in his throat. "Rachel," he said, "people who need visible proof of worth usually have very little of their own." I didn't answer right away. The truth was I'd spent years pretending their opinions didn't matter. But opinions from strangers slide off easier than disappointment from your own family. Especially when you're tired. And I was tired. Not physically, not exactly. Soul tired. 12 years of canceled plans. 12 years of never fully unpacking because I was always waiting for another assignment. 12 years of watching civilian friends build lives while mine stayed locked behind security clearances and government non-disclosure agreements. There were nights I seriously considered leaving. I was close to 20 years now. Retirement benefits were finally visible on the horizon. But lately I'd caught myself browsing real estate listings in quiet towns, looking at lake houses, garden patios, bookstores with attached cafes, normal life fantasies, the kind soldiers don't say out loud. Granddad interrupted my thoughts. "You still there?" "Yeah." "You remember what I told you after Afghanistan?" I smiled faintly. "Barely." "You told me not to hand my worth to people who can't carry it." "That's right." His voice softened. "You've spent your entire adult life protecting people who will never know your name. Don't let small-minded relatives convince you that makes your life small." I swallowed hard after that. Because there are moments when encouragement hits too close to the bruise. To change the subject, I asked, "How are your knees?" "Terrible." "How's the hip?" "Worse." "You taking your medication?" A pause. "Mostly." "Granddad." "What, at my age, every pill has another pill attached to it." That made me laugh for real. There he was, the old general who could survive Pentagon politics but still treated prescriptions like enemy propaganda. Then his tone shifted slightly. "Your father came by this afternoon." The warmth left my chest. What did he want? To discuss practical matters. That phrase alone told me plenty. Meaning, he thinks I need help managing things. I sat up straighter. What things? Oh, the usual. Finances, property, medical decisions. He paused. Apparently turning 88 means people start measuring your curtains before you're dead. Something cold slid quietly into my stomach. Did he actually say that? No. But I've lived long enough to hear what people mean underneath the polite version. I stood and walked toward my kitchen window. Across the street, my neighbor's Christmas lights blinked red and white against the dark. How bad is it? I asked. Granddad didn't answer immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice had changed. Less grandfather, more commander. Rachel, did your father ever tell you what happened in 1987? I frowned. What do you mean? The business deal that saved this family. I thought he built Bennett Properties himself. Another silence. Longer this time. Then, that's the story your father prefers. I felt every muscle in my shoulders tighten. Granddad, I said carefully, what aren't you telling me? I heard him shift slowly in his chair, probably wincing from the arthritis he pretended not to have. Then he said the sentence that changed everything. I think your father is preparing to bury me before I'm gone. The room around me suddenly felt very still. And for the first time since Christmas dinner, I realized this wasn't about hurt feelings anymore. Something much uglier had already started moving underneath the surface. 3 days after Christmas, I drove back to Knoxville. Not because I wanted another family argument. Because when an 88-year-old retired 4-star general tells you he thinks his own son is preparing to push him aside, you don't stay home and hope it works itself out. I took leave from work under the excuse of family medical concerns, which technically wasn't a lie. My commander approved it in under 30 seconds and told me to keep my phone nearby. That's military language for we trust you, but we may still need you. I arrived at Granddad's house just after noon. He lived alone in a brick ranch home outside Maryville, about 30 minutes south of Knoxville, tucked into a quiet neighborhood full of old maple trees and retired couples who waved at everybody whether they knew them or not. His house smelled like black coffee, old books, and cedar. The same smell it had my entire life. I let myself in with the spare key hidden inside a rusted coffee can near the garage. Worst secret hiding place on earth. Granddad insisted nobody would think to look there because people under 50 don't drink real coffee anymore. He was sitting at the kitchen table wearing a gray cardigan over a white t-shirt, reading glasses, low on his nose, a heating pad draped across one knee. You look terrible, he said without looking up. You sound healthy enough to insult people. That's how you know I'm alive. I dropped my overnight bag near the hallway and poured myself coffee from the old Mr. Coffee machine on the counter. It tasted strong enough to remove paint. Exactly how he liked it. For a while neither of us talked. Rain tapped softly against the kitchen windows. Somewhere down the street somebody was using a leaf blower despite it being December. Tennessee people will find yard work if you leave them unsupervised long enough. Finally I said, tell me the truth. Granddad folded his newspaper carefully before answering. When your grandmother died in 1987, your father was drowning financially. I frowned. Dad said the business was struggling, but he rebuilt it. He rebuilt it with my money. That landed harder than I expected. Granddad reached slowly toward the center of the table and slid a thin manila folder toward me. Open it. Inside were copies of bank transfers, loan agreements, and legal documents older than I was when Clinton was president. My father's signature sat at the bottom of every page. I leaned back in my chair. He borrowed this much. He needed more than money, Granddad said. He needed protection, reputation, connections. He had overextended himself trying to look successful. That sounded painfully familiar. He promised repayment, Granddad continued. We created a family trust structure to protect the assets until he stabilized. But he never told anybody. Number. I flipped another page, then another. The deeper I went, the quieter the room seemed to get. There were handwritten notes from lawyers, copies of property agreements, amendments, letters between my father and Granddad discussing timelines and obligations. One phrase kept repeating. Temporary stewardship. Not ownership? I looked up slowly. So technically, Granddad interrupted much of what your father presents as solely his was never fully his to begin with. I stared at him. Why didn't you ever say anything? He gave a tired shrug. Because pride makes fools out of old men, too. He rubbed his knee absently. I thought if I gave him enough time he'd make it right himself. But he didn't. Number. Outside the rain got heavier. The gutters rattled softly. I looked back at the paperwork again, and something ugly started connecting itself in my head. Mark knows, doesn't he? Granddad's silence answered before his mouth did. Some of it, he admitted. That's why he's suddenly circling around your finances. Granddad nodded once. I stood and walked toward the kitchen sink, mostly because sitting still suddenly felt impossible. My father had spent decades acting like he built the Bennett name through hard work and sacrifice alone. Every lecture, every smug speech about responsibility, every time he looked disappointed in me for not living the kind of life he respected. And underneath all of it, a foundation he never admitted another man poured. I braced both hands against the counter. I don't understand something. What? Why now? Granddad took off his glasses slowly. Because Mark's company is bleeding money. That stopped me cold. What? You didn't know. Number. Well, he said dryly, that makes one person in Tennessee. I turned around. His business looks fine. Appearances are expensive. That sounded like something he'd been thinking about for a while. Granddad reached for another folder beside his chair. Smaller this time. Inside were newspaper clippings, local business reports, and printed court filings tied to development delays in Sevier County. Mark's company had several condo projects tied up in permit disputes and contractor lawsuits. Nothing catastrophic yet, but enough to hurt. Enough to scare him. He leveraged too much too fast, Granddad said. Your brother likes looking successful almost as much as your father does. I sat back down slowly. Suddenly Christmas dinner looked different. Mark hadn't mocked me because he felt powerful. He mocked me because he was desperate. That didn't excuse it. But it explained the smell of panic underneath all that confidence. I rubbed my face. This is insane. No, Granddad said quietly. This is family. That might have been the saddest sentence I'd heard all year. I looked down at the paperwork again. Part of me wanted to shove the folders back across the table and walk away from all of it. I wasn't a lawyer. I wasn't an accountant. My entire adult life revolved around solving problems that stayed clean on paper even when they were dangerous. This was emotional landmine territory. You should have told me sooner, I said softly. Granddad studied me for a moment. Would you have wanted to know? I opened my mouth, then closed it again. Because honestly, maybe not. There's comfort in believing your family history makes sense. Even flawed families build myths that help everybody sleep at night. Mine was simple. Dad built the business. Mark inherited the ambition. I was the odd daughter who disappeared into military life because she never fit the family mold. Easy story. Clean story. False story. Granddad pushed himself carefully out of his chair with a quiet grunt. His hip clearly hurt worse than he admitted. Come on, he said. Where? My office. His home office sat near the back of the house beside a small enclosed porch. The room looked frozen somewhere around 1998. Old military plaques, framed photographs, bookshelves stuffed with history biographies and binders. An American flag folded inside a triangular glass case sat behind the desk. Granddad lowered himself into his chair slowly. Then he opened the bottom drawer of his desk and pulled out a black metal lockbox. I noticed his hands shaking slightly as he unlocked it. Age humbles everybody eventually. Inside were more papers, and one thing that made my stomach tighten instantly. A copy of legal paperwork already filed with a local attorney's office. Petition for competency review. My father's name was on it. So was Mark's. I looked up sharply. They actually filed this preliminary paperwork, Granddad said. Nothing official yet. Their attorney's testing the ground. The room felt suddenly airless. They're trying to declare you mentally unfit. Yes. I stared at the page so hard the words blurred. Grounds for concern regarding memory lapses and financial vulnerability. Memory lapses. Jesus Christ. The man forgot where he put his reading glasses sometimes. He wasn't wandering through traffic talking to ghosts. Anger hit me then. Real anger. Clean and hot. Not because of the money. Because I knew exactly what this would do to him. Men like my grandfather survive on dignity long after their bodies begin failing them. Strip that away publicly, and it feels like burial before death. I sat down heavily across from him. What do you want me to do? Granddad watched me carefully. That depends. On what? On whether you still believe telling the truth makes you cruel. I looked away. Because that was the problem. Part of me still did. Even now I didn't want revenge. I wanted my family to stop forcing me to choose between silence and self-respect. Granddad leaned back slowly, wincing again. Rachel, he said quietly, truth isn't revenge. It's just a debt coming due. I sat there listening to the rain hit the roof while the weight of everything settled over me. Then my phone buzzed in my jacket pocket. A text message. Unknown number. I opened it. Need to discuss your grandfather privately. Family meeting soon. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. No signature. But I knew exactly who sent it. Mark. And for the first time in my life, I realized my brother wasn't underestimating me anymore. He was warning me. I didn't answer Mark's text. That may sound small, but in my family, silence could make people crazier than shouting. Mark liked control. He liked fast replies, corner booths, valet parking, and conversations where everybody understood he was the important one before he even sat down. Leaving him unread felt almost childish. So I left him unread. Granddad watched me set the phone face down on his desk. Your brother, he asked. Unknown number. He raised one eyebrow. Fine, Mark. Granddad nodded like he'd expected that. What did he say? I repeated the message. Need to discuss your grandfather privately. Family meeting soon. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. Granddad leaned back in his chair and let out a slow breath through his nose. Harder for whom? That was the question, wasn't it? For the next week, I stayed at Granddad's house and pretended I was only there to help with groceries, doctor's appointments, and winter chores. I replaced the porch light, picked up his prescriptions at the Walgreens on Lamar Alexander Parkway, made sure he ate something besides toast coffee and those little butter cookies from the blue tin. He complained about all of it. You know, he said one morning while I scrambled eggs, I survived 2 wars in the Pentagon. You also forgot lunch yesterday. I chose not to participate in lunch. You ate peanut butter with a spoon. That's protein. That was Granddad, stubborn enough to argue with nutrition. But beneath the dry humor, his body was giving him trouble. He moved slower in the mornings. His fingers cramped when he buttoned his shirt. One afternoon I found him standing in the hallway, one hand against the wall, eyes closed. Dizzy, I asked. He opened his eyes too quickly. Number. Granddad. A little. I got him into his chair and brought water. He hated needing help. I hated seeing him hate it. Old age isn't gentle. People romanticize it in greeting cards, but the real thing is pill bottles lined beside the sink, heating pads on knees, bruises that show up without explanation, and the quiet fear of becoming a problem to the people you raised. That was exactly what my father and Mark were counting on. Not that Granddad was incompetent, that he looked vulnerable enough for the accusation to stick. On January 3rd, Granddad introduced me to Eleanor Price. She arrived at 10 in the morning in a beige Buick, wearing a green wool coat, sensible black shoes, and an expression that suggested she had been disappointed in fools since the Carter administration. She was 72, a retired estate attorney, and apparently one of Granddad's oldest friends. Major Bennett, she said, shaking my hand. Ms. Price. Eleanor, Ms. Price sounds like I'm about to scold a bank teller. Granddad muttered, you probably have. Only when necessary. I liked her immediately. We sat around Granddad's kitchen table with coffee folders, legal pads, and a box of donuts Eleanor brought from a place in Alcoa that still made them fresh before sunrise. She took one bite of a glazed donut, wiped her fingers with a napkin, and said, Your father and brother are not as clever as they are confident. That seems to run in the mail line, I said. Granddad looked offended. Eleanor smiled. Present company mostly excluded. Then she got serious. She explained what we needed. Medical documentation showing Granddad was physically aging but mentally competent. Financial records showing the old trust arrangements. Witnesses who remembered the 1987 agreements. Any communications from my father and Mark suggesting motive. And recordings, I asked. Eleanor looked at me over her glasses. Tennessee is a one-party consent state. If one person in the conversation consents to the recording, that generally helps us. But nobody gets cute. No hiding devices in rooms, no third-party eavesdropping, no spy nonsense. I lifted both hands, understood. Granddad gave me a look. What I said. You looked disappointed. I work with rules for a living. Of course you do. We began carefully. Legally. Slowly. That was the part nobody sees in revenge stories. The paperwork. The waiting. The frustration. The way doing things right takes 3 times longer than doing something stupid. Eleanor contacted an old banker named Harold Whitcomb, who had handled several of the early property transfers back in the late 80s. He was retired, living outside Loudon, and still remembered my father clearly. Your father had expensive shoes and nervous eyes, Harold told me on the phone. I don't forget that combination. Harold agreed to meet Mark for lunch at Cherokee Country Club, where Mark apparently liked to hold court, near a window overlooking the golf course. Eleanor coached him carefully. You are not baiting him, she said. You are not tricking him. You are having a conversation you are legally part of. If he chooses to brag, that is his burden. Harold chuckled. "Ma'am, men like Mark Bennett don't choose to brag. They breathe and it happens." 2 days later, Harold called. His voice sounded half amused, half disgusted. "He talked for 40 minutes, he said. After 2 bourbons and a shrimp cocktail, that boy would have confessed to stealing the Liberty Bell if he thought it made him look rich. The recording wasn't cinematic, no dramatic music, no perfect villain speech. Just Mark being Mark. He complained that Granddad was slipping. He said my father had waited long enough. He joked that the old man probably wouldn't make it to Independence Day, and if he did, he won't know what paperwork he signed." I listened to it once. Then I took my headphones off and walked outside. The January air cut right through my sweater. Granddad's backyard sloped down toward a line of bare trees. A neighbor had wind chimes hanging from a porch, and they made a thin, sad sound in the cold. I wanted to be satisfied. I wasn't. I felt sick. Because proof doesn't always feel like victory. Sometimes it just confirms what you were praying wasn't true. My father was part of this. My brother was the loud one, but my father's silence was all over the recording. He hadn't stopped Mark, hadn't softened him, hadn't protected his own father, and he sure hadn't protected me. That night I almost quit the whole thing. I sat at Granddad's kitchen table after he went to bed, staring at all those folders stacked beside my laptop. The house was quiet except for the refrigerator clicking on and the low rumble of a train somewhere far off. I thought about calling Eleanor and saying, "Let the lawyers handle it." I thought about going back to Fayetteville and disappearing into work where betrayal had file numbers and solutions. Family was messier. Family made you hesitate. Around midnight, Granddad came down the hallway in his robe, gripping his cane. "You're thinking too loudly," he said. "I'm thinking this is going to destroy everyone." He eased into the chair across from me, his movements careful, jaw tight from pain. "No," he said. "Lies did that. We're just turning on the lights." I looked at his hands. The knuckles were swollen. His wedding ring hung loose on his finger now. "What if I become like them?" I asked. That was the thing I hadn't said out loud. What if I enjoy it too much? Granddad studied me for a long moment. Then he said, "The fact that you're asking means you haven't." 2 mornings later, he fell in the bathroom. I heard the thud from the guest room. By the time I got to him, he was sitting on the tile floor, furious and embarrassed, one hand pressed against his hip. "I'm fine," he snapped. "You're on the floor." I'm resting aggressively. Even scared half to death, I laughed. Then I called an ambulance. At Blount Memorial, the doctors said nothing was broken, but they wanted to observe him overnight. His blood pressure had dropped. Dehydration, they said. Medication interaction, maybe. Normal old person stuff. That phrase made me angry. Normal didn't mean small. He looked smaller in the hospital bed, though. Hospitals do that. They take powerful people and put them under thin blankets with plastic wristbands and paper cups of pills. Late that night, after the nurse dimmed the lights, he opened his eyes. "Rachel." "I'm here." "Old age is a thief," he said, voice rough. "It takes your knees first. Then it comes for your pride if you let it." I squeezed his hand. He looked toward the window where Knoxville lights blurred against the dark. "But it doesn't get to take the truth." I didn't trust my voice, so I just nodded. Before he was discharged the next morning, he turned to me with that old command returning to his face. "Call your mother," he said. "And tell her what?" "Tell her I'm hosting the 4th of July. I stared at him. "Granddad, that's 6 months away. I know how calendars work. You just got out of a hospital bed. Then I have 6 months to improve my posture." I shook my head, but he wasn't joking. "Not really. The trap had already been built. The only thing left was inviting the people who thought it belonged to them." By the time 4th of July came around, my family had convinced themselves Granddad was throwing one last patriotic barbecue because he was lonely. That was the story my mother told everyone. "Dad wants the whole family together," she said on the phone in late June. "You know how he gets around the holidays." I didn't correct her. People believe whatever lets them sleep. The gathering was at Granddad's house in Maryville. He had insisted on it, even though my mother offered 3 times to host at her place in Knoxville. He said he wanted his own porch, his own grill, and his own flag out front. By 10 that morning, the neighborhood smelled like charcoal and cut grass. Little American flags lined the walkway. Somebody down the street was already setting off illegal fireworks, because apparently patience is not a constitutional requirement. I arrived early to help. Granddad was sitting in his recliner wearing khaki pants, a white button-down shirt, and a navy blazer, even though it was already 90 degrees outside. "You're going to roast," I told him. "I have suffered worse for worse reasons. You could wear a polo like a normal person." I was never promoted for looking normal. Eleanor Price stood in the kitchen arranging folders inside a leather briefcase. She wore a pale blue pantsuit and orthopedic shoes, and somehow still looked more dangerous than anybody else in the house. "Is he behaving?" she asked me. "Number." "Good," I was worried. Around noon, relatives started arriving with folding chairs, covered dishes, grocery store pies, and that forced holiday cheer families use when they know something is wrong, but nobody has permission to say it. My mother brought potato salad in her big yellow Tupperware bowl. Dad carried in 2 coolers like a man proving usefulness. Mark showed up last in a white Mercedes SUV wearing sunglasses, a striped polo, and a smile that looked imported. He kissed my mother on the cheek, shook hands with 2 uncles, and gave me a quick look. Not a greeting. An assessment. "Rachel," he said, "still here. For now?" His smile tightened. My father came up behind him. "Let's keep today peaceful." I looked at him for a second. He had aged since Christmas. Not much, but enough. His hair seemed thinner at the temples. His face carried the strain of a man holding together too many lies with too little sleep. "Peaceful would be nice," I said. He didn't like the way I said it. By 1 o'clock, everyone had plates. Hot dogs, ribs, baked beans, deviled eggs, watermelon cut into uneven chunks. Kids ran across the yard with sparklers they weren't supposed to have yet. Aunts sat under the shade tree gossiping with paper fans from a local funeral home. It all looked normal. That was the strangest part. Family can look perfectly normal 5 minutes before the floor gives out. Granddad waited until after the food. Always strategic. He let people eat. Let Mark talk too loudly about interest rates and property values. Let Dad tell the same story about building Bennett properties from nothing, which he must have told at least 100 times in my life. This time I watched Granddad's face while he listened. No anger. No sadness. Just finality. At 2:30, Eleanor tapped her spoon gently against a glass. Not loud, just enough. Conversation thinned. Granddad stood slowly from his chair on the patio. I moved instinctively to help him, but he gave me that tiny shake of his head. So I stopped. He wanted everyone to see the effort. Not because he wanted pity, but because he wanted them to understand something simple. A weak body was not the same as a weak mind. He leaned on his cane and looked around at the people gathered in his yard. "Thank you all for coming," he said. His voice wasn't booming anymore. Age had taken some of that from him. But command doesn't live in volume. It lives in certainty. I wanted everyone here because there are matters involving this family that should no longer be handled in whispers. Mark's sunglasses came off. My father set his plate down. Granddad nodded to Eleanor. She opened her briefcase. My mother said, "Dad, what is this?" Granddad looked at her gently. "The truth, Linda." That was all. Eleanor began with the medical letters. Not dramatic, not emotional, just facts. Granddad's primary care doctor, his neurologist, a cognitive screening from the previous month, all showing the same thing: physically limited, mentally competent, capable of managing personal and financial affairs. Mark laughed once. A short, sharp sound. "Are we seriously doing this at a barbecue?" Eleanor looked over her glasses. "Mr. Bennett, if you prefer, we can do it in court." That shut him up for almost 7 seconds. Then came the 1987 documents. The loan agreements. The property records. The trust language. Temporary stewardship. Eleanor explained it plainly without legal fog. Granddad had saved my father's business after my grandmother died. My father had signed agreements acknowledging that certain assets were protected under family trust interests. Over time, he had presented those assets publicly as if they had always been solely his. My Aunt Carol put a hand over her mouth. One of my cousins whispered, "Wait, what?" Dad stood up. "This is not the place." Granddad turned toward him. "You had 39 years to choose the place." My father's face changed. I'd seen him angry many times, but this was different. This was exposure. A man can survive being disliked. Being seen is harder. Mark stepped forward. "Granddad, you're confused." There it was. The word he had been waiting to use in public. Confused. Granddad's hand tightened on his cane, but his voice stayed even. "Eleanor." She removed a small speaker from her bag and connected it to her phone. The recording started. Harold Whitcomb's voice came first, casual and slow, asking Mark about the Sevier County projects. Then Mark. Relaxed, smug, bourbon-warmed. Dad waited long enough. Granddad's slipping. He doesn't understand half of what he signs anymore. If he makes it to Independence Day, I'll be shocked. The yard went silent except for cicadas buzzing in the trees. The recording continued. Mark laughed on the audio. "Once we get competency handled, everything gets simpler." My mother whispered, "Oh my God." The real Mark standing 5 feet away went pale. "That's taken out of context," Harold's voice on the recording asked. "And Rachel?" Mark snorted through the speaker. "Rachel. She's a uniform with a mortgage. She won't know what hit her." I felt that one in my chest. Not because it surprised me, because he had said it so easily. Like reducing me was a reflex. My father looked at me then. For 1 second I thought I saw regret. Then he looked away. Granddad raised one hand and Eleanor stopped the audio. Nobody moved. Even the kids had gone quiet, sensing adult disaster. My father spoke first. "Dad, this is family business. You're humiliating us." Granddad looked tired suddenly. Not weak. Tired. "You tried to bury me while I was still breathing." My father flinched like the words had crossed the yard and struck him. Mark's face hardened. Desperation was showing through the expensive sunglasses now hanging from his collar. "You think giving everything to Rachel fixes anything?" he snapped. "She doesn't even belong here half the time." And there it was again. The real wound dressed as an argument. I expected Granddad to explode. He didn't. He turned to me instead. "Major Bennett," he said, "would you step forward?" My legs felt strangely heavy, but I did. Every eye in that yard turned toward me. I hated it. I had spent my career avoiding attention, staying useful in the background. Being watched like that made my skin prickle. Granddad looked at the family. "I did not change my estate plan because Rachel wears a uniform," he said. "I did not do it because she is my granddaughter, and I certainly did not do it to punish disappointment." Mark muttered something under his breath. Granddad ignored him. "I changed stewardship of the Bennett Family Foundation because she is the only person in this family who has practiced service without demanding applause." I looked down fast. I didn't want them to see what that did to me. Eleanor handed him a document, and he held it with both hands because one would have shaken too much. "The foundation will now focus on military families, surviving spouses, and elderly citizens facing financial exploitation," he said. "Rachel will oversee the board with Eleanor as legal advisor." My mother began crying softly. My father sat down like his knees had finally given up. Mark stared at Granddad. "You can't do that." Eleanor smiled. "Barely. He already did." That was the satisfying part. Not loud, not flashy, just 4 words calmly delivered by a 72-year-old woman in comfortable shoes. He already did. Mark looked around the yard, probably expecting someone to defend him. Nobody did. Because facts have a way of making cowards suddenly lonely. Then Granddad turned to my father. "I gave you time," he said. "I gave you money. I gave you silence. You mistook all 3 for weakness." My father's mouth opened, but nothing came out. For the first time in my life, he had no lecture ready. No moral speech. No disappointed father routine. Just the truth sitting between us like a bill finally delivered. I should tell you I felt triumphant. I didn't. Not exactly. There was satisfaction, yes. I won't lie about that. Watching Mark's arrogance collapse in front of the very people he used to impress was not unpleasant. But beside that satisfaction was grief. Because justice can be clean and still hurt. My family had not become strangers that day. They had simply revealed how long they had been strangers wearing familiar faces. As people began drifting away quieter than they'd arrived, Granddad lowered himself back into his chair. His hand trembled badly now. I knelt beside him. "You okay?" He looked at the flag moving gently beside the porch. "No," he said, "but I'm right. And that I learned is sometimes the best you get." A year later, people still ask me what happened after that 4th of July. Usually they wanted the exciting version. They wanted me to say, "Mark lost everything Dad begged for forgiveness on the porch," and I rode off into the sunset with the Bennett Foundation checkbook in one hand and justice in the other. Real life is rarely that tidy. Mark didn't lose everything, but he lost enough. 2 of his Sevier County projects collapsed under the weight of lawsuits and bad financing. A few investors started asking harder questions. His face disappeared from the billboards along Alcoa Highway and got replaced by a roofing company promising free storm inspections. I won't pretend I didn't enjoy that a little. My father stayed quiet for months. That was new. He didn't apologize at first. Men like my father don't know how to apologize without treating it like a negotiation. He sent me articles about veterans' charities. Left a voicemail on Veterans Day that began with, "I hope you know I always respected your service," which was so far from the truth I had to sit down and laugh for a minute. Not because it was funny, because sometimes laughing is safer than screaming. My mother tried to patch things up the way mothers often do, not by dealing with the wound but by suggesting dinner. "Couldn't we all just come together?" she asked me one Sunday afternoon. I was sitting in my truck outside a Harris Teeter in Fayetteville Groceries, melting in the back seat, listening to her try to make peace out of ingredients nobody had admitted buying. "I'll come to dinner," I told her. "But I won't sit at any table where being family means swallowing disrespect." She got quiet. Then she said, "That sounds hard." "It is. But you mean it." "I do." That was the beginning of my boundary. Not dramatic, no slammed doors, no speech worthy of a movie trailer. Just a line. And for once I didn't move it to make everyone else comfortable. The foundation work started slower than people imagine. There were board meetings, tax filings, policy drafts, awkward donor calls, and one website redesign that almost made me miss classified briefings. Eleanor Price stayed on as legal advisor exactly as Granddad wanted. She ran meetings with a yellow legal pad, a thermos of coffee, and the patience of a woman who had outlived several generations of foolish men. At our first official board meeting, she tapped her pen and said, "Let's be clear. We are not here to create a memorial to anyone's ego." I said, "Should we put that on the website?" She looked at me. "I'm tempted." We funded our first case in October. A retired Navy widow outside Chattanooga had nearly lost her home after her nephew convinced her to sign financial documents she didn't understand. The foundation paid for legal help and emergency housing support while the case moved through court. When Eleanor called to tell me the woman had kept her house, I sat in my office for a long time without saying anything. That was the first moment I understood what Granddad had really done. He hadn't handed me revenge. He had handed me direction. The military part of my life continued the same way it always had. Early mornings, secure rooms, flights booked under vague labels, holidays penciled in but never trusted. I still couldn't tell my family much. I still answered logistics when church ladies asked what I did. Only now I didn't shrink when they looked unimpressed. That was new too. Granddad declined over that year. Not all at once. That would have been easier to explain. It happened in little thefts. His walk got shorter. His naps got longer. His hands shook more when he lifted his coffee. Some mornings he called me by my grandmother's name, first caught himself, then looked embarrassed enough to break my heart. "Don't make that face," he told me once. "What face?" "The face people make when they're grieving someone who's still in the room." That shut me up. He hated being fussed over, but he eventually allowed a part-time home health aide named Loretta to come by 4 days a week. She was 61 from Cleveland, Tennessee, and the only person I ever saw bully him successfully. "You don't scare me, General," she told him one morning when he refused his medication. "I've scared better people. I bet they were easier to deal with." He took the pills. I loved her for that. My father did visit him, I'll give him that. At first, the visits were stiff and formal. Dad would sit too straight in the living room asking about blood pressure and prescriptions like a nervous bank manager. Granddad answered politely, but the warmth between them had thinned. One afternoon I walked in and found them sitting on the porch together. No big confession. No dramatic embrace. Just two old wounds breathing the same air. Dad looked at me and said, "Rachel." "Dad." Granddad watched both of us like he was too tired to referee. My father stood and rubbed his palms on his jeans. "I owe you an apology," he said. I waited. A year earlier I would have helped him, filled in the blanks, made it easier. Not anymore. He looked down at the porch boards. "I was ashamed of what I knew about myself," he said. "And I took it out on you because you were the one person I couldn't explain away." That was not the apology I expected. "It was better than sorry if you were hurt. It was also late. Very late." I nodded. "Thank you for saying that." His face tightened slightly like he had hoped forgiveness would arrive faster. I said, "I'm not ready to pretend we're okay." He swallowed. "I understand." I wasn't sure he did, but that was his work, not mine. Mark never apologized. He sent one email through a lawyer accusing everyone of emotional manipulation and legacy interference, which Eleanor printed out corrected with a red pen and filed under a tab labeled "Nonsense." I kept that folder. For morale. The last time Granddad called me Major, he was sitting in his recliner with a blanket over his legs, looking out at the maple tree in his front yard. It was late November. The leaves were almost gone. I had driven up after a rough week, the kind I couldn't describe except to say I was tired in places sleep didn't reach. He looked smaller than he had at Christmas, smaller than 4th of July, but when I walked in, his eyes found me. "Major," he said. Just one word, but it put me back together. I sat beside him and held his hand. His skin felt cool and thin, the bones more present than before. "You okay?" I asked. He smiled faintly. "Terrible question. Everyone asks old people if they're okay because they don't know what else to do. What should I ask? Ask if I'm still me. I looked at him. Are you? He squeezed my hand, weak but certain. Most days. We sat like that for a while. No TV, no speeches, just the furnace clicking on and the soft sound of Loretta washing dishes in the kitchen. Then he said, a name is just noise until somebody gives it honor. I didn't answer. I couldn't. I thought about that Christmas table. Mark's glass in the air, my father's nod, my own hands clenched in my lap. I thought about how badly I'd wanted them to see me, and how strange it was to finally understand that being seen by the wrong people can become its own kind of prison. The people who called me a nobody still don't know what I did for my country. They never will. But they learned one thing. I was never the one who disgraced the Bennett name.